I was born in Toronto, in Forest Hill Village.
Okay.
All right, that's already wrong. I was born on Darcy Street, but my father and mother moved to Forest Hill Village, which was a separate part of Toronto with its own administration, its own education system, a little capsule that was self-governed. And I went to Forest Hill schools.
Okay.
And graduated from Forest Hill Collegiate. My parents are from Europe, from Poland and Latvia, and each of them lived in Europe during the First World War. And my mother came in 1919, partly because my grandfather had come to Canada and then the war broke out, and he was a master tailor, and he amassed some money decorating garments for the clergy, all of their liturgical veils, and he would be the embroiderer. And he went back to Poland in 1918 and wanted to start a business there. And my eldest aunt, who was very tough, said that if he didn't take her to Canada, she would kill herself. So, knowing that she would, he took the family to Canada, and that was how my mother's family came in 1919. My father was sent a little bit later by his parents because he was approaching draft age. And to be in the army of whatever country it was at that time, it was either Russia or Poland, was to be fighting an enemy within, because the Poles, Catholics, were so anti-Semitic, and any Jewish boy in the army was subject to all sorts of harassment, if not physical injury. So some of these boys would cut their fingers off in order not to be able to serve. Some of them emigrated, and my father, who was 18 and his brother 16, emigrated at that time, and that was in the 20s. So I'm first generation. I went to Smith College for a year and had the experience that I thought I wanted. I was not happy there. It was very old-fashioned in the sense that there were curfews and there were all sorts of punishments for not returning library books. And the women there, girls, who I thought would be so brilliant and intellectual, turned out to be wanting to go to secretarial school and get married. So they didn't have any particular ambitions. This was the beginning of the 1960s, before the 1960s that we remember. And I felt like a misfit there, but when I came back to Toronto, I enjoyed my final year, and that was when I felt that I belonged at somewhere in Toronto at that campus.
Okay.
The one thing that happened to me that was extremely positive at Smith, first of all, the standards of the teachers was very high. And I had a wonderful art course by a woman named Mrs. Vanderpool. And I sat in those classes. She would turn the lights off and she would show modern art slides, and I became acquainted with Paul Klee and other 20th century artists. And that just opened my eyes, because it was the most pleasurable education I'd ever had. And so I decided that that was something that I liked, not really at that point knowing that I would do anything about it. My parents weren't particularly attuned to culture. They wanted us to be educated. It was very important. But educated so that you could marry a doctor and then, raise children and do those kind of conventional things. And I think that I bought into that. So I didn't think of art as a profession or anything as a profession at that time. But I knew I had to learn something. I went to the Ontario College of Education, and I took English and history as my principal subjects and art as a alternative subject. But I never taught. I went to the States and I worked in the States because David, my boyfriend, was at school. And this sort of fitted into my dream of being engaged to someone who wanted to be a professor and to live in an interesting community. So we were living, he was going to Harvard, getting his doctorate there, and that sounded great to me. And I was working as a social worker because at that time, in 1965 and 66, Lyndon Johnson established the Office of Economic Opportunity. And there was a shortage of social workers. There was all sorts of social programs, Head Start mainly, and other kinds of Medicare at that time. And it was all because John Kennedy was assassinated, and all of the things that he wanted to do that were pie in the sky became more realistic as a kind of tribute to him. And Johnson, with his extraordinary skills as a legislator, was able to twist arms and get this legislation passed. So because there were programs that were new, and because I was trained in teaching, I was considered for a job in social work, and I ended up as a geriatric social worker. That was also partly because I understood Yiddish.
Okay.
And these people were in Jewish social clubs. And it was my job to organize their social programs. They're getting together a couple of times a week. And also, if there were problems among them, as there usually were, having to do with health, especially in finances, then I was supposed to refer them to people who could help them. It had to do with moving to London.
Okay.
Because after Boston, which was such an interesting center, David got a postdoc at Oxford. So we lived in England for 2 years, and my son was born there. And that was also an extremely interesting community and a wonderful experience for both of us. And then David took a job by the 1970s in Ontario. There weren't the same number of academic opportunities as there had been in the mid-60s with the opening of York University and other universities. So everybody who could breathe in and out got an academic job at that time. Later on, it was harder. And the Western job was the only job that he was offered. And I kind of thought, well, we'll go to London for a couple of years, then we'll go to another place that's more interesting. Well, here we are. So many years later. My son was born in England, and I was looking after him, and I became pregnant, and I realized that this was not everything it was cracked up to be, that I was so bored and so busy in a way that was kind of cyclic, you know, change a diaper, the diaper gets wet, you change the diaper, you cook a meal, it gets eaten, you cook a meal, and I was isolated. And so I began to think back on what was important to me as a student, and it was that I loved the art program that I was in at Smith, and that I did take some art courses in Boston. And in fact, my experience in Boston also triggered my interest in pattern and decoration, because there was a lot of examples of Pennsylvania Dutch decoration on furniture and documents, birth, death documents, family trees. There was an exhibition at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts of the decorative art of Charles and Maurice Prendergast, who decorated chests and mirrors and paintings and furniture, and they were delightful. And I loved that you could enjoy art in such a direct way, something that was lovingly painted, lovingly considered. And so those are the threads kind of that all came together in this decision to go back to school and to be a painter. But in order to do that, I had to justify my application, and that was to say that I wanted to major in art as a high school teacher rather than English or history. And I had no intention of being a teacher. I hated teaching. But I did get into the program, and I took one course the first year, an art history course, and then I started my studio practice the second year with Duncan de Kirkemo. And at the time I was there, the visual art department was still a Quonset hut on campus, you know, and there was leaking all the time and floods, and the years went on and I would take one or two courses. And I was lucky because Patterson Ewan was a teacher there. And he was extremely tolerant, in fact, maybe oblivious to the fact that I was an adult student. You know, he treated me in the way he would treat anybody, which was with patience and sort of decency and some sort of willingness to understand what it was I was doing. And so that turned out to be a very positive experience, and he was a great influence on me. Not because his work influenced the work that I did, but because he was such a decent human being, and because he was so tolerant, and if you were working, he would try to understand what it was you were doing, and then he would direct you in a very subtle way. Jack Chambers lived across the street from me. When we first moved to London, Nancy Poole had sold one of his paintings, it might have been Sunday Morning #1, for $25,000. And that was the most that any Canadian artist had ever gotten for a painting. And it was in the papers, and I was so thrilled to have an artist living across the street. And he knew I was interested in painting, although I was going to school. I would never have considered myself a painter at that time. And he would invite me into a studio and show me what he was doing. And one of the things I remember in particular was that he had a painting of his family, including him. He worked from photographs at the dining table. And underneath the dining table was an oriental rug. And the first time I saw the rug, it was a perfectly beautiful rendering of the rug. When I came in again, you know, every couple of months he would ask me to come, it was a white blank because it didn't meet his standards, and so he painted it out and he tried again. Now here's a guy who's living with a chronic disease that could kill him any time, but he has a perfect rug in a painting and he paints it out because it's not good enough. And it took him so long to put it back in. And it would be painted out and in several times. I mean, I don't even know how many times. But to see that the perfection of the work, or the satisfaction that he had to feel in order to feel that a work was finished, was so intensely important, that also showed me how to be a fine artist. And it didn't matter what his painting sold for, but he had such great integrity, and that was true of Patterson as well. So meeting those two people was very important to me. First, I left the studio, and I was interested in women's issues. Feminism was creeping into people's consciousness, and when I first went into the school, it was clear that if you wanted to do something pretty, you would get a terrible mark. I don't think they'd have failed you, but you had to be tough. And I mean, I wasn't particularly tough. I had no interest in being tough. but you couldn't be sentimental. Then in the mid-70s, pattern and decoration evolved as a movement. And so I began decorating things at home, or describing things at home. And I painted all my kids' diapers once they were out of diapers, and I hung them on a line, and every day I'd wet them, and then they'd dry, and I'd gather them up and put them back on the line. Then I did a series of quilts. That was my first exhibition, and I painted colors, I cut them out and I sewed them together. So it was a kind of feminism, domestic feminism, that I was working with, but also the idea of pattern. And in a way, that's never gone away. So there's always an order, there's always a structure. There's a desire for a beautiful surface. There's a desire to make these things that I put into the world accessible at a certain level, so that there's no confusion or indifference to something that doesn't bring you in. I want to be intelligible. I worked in Bob Bozak's studio, which was unheated. I paid $35 a month, and I had to stoke up this incredible thing in the middle of the room that was supposed to give off heat. Well, by the time I left for the day, it was a little bit warmer than it had been when I came in, but I felt like an artist. I felt that I was, in a garret, and I was suffering. So it was a good experience for me. Wonder at the artists who formed a nucleus around Greg Curnow and other people, Murray Favreau, Ron Martin. They were, to me, celebrities. The teachers who were also artists, at least I got to know them, and I had a more realistic view of what they were like. But the Forest City Gallery was a kind of stellar place where all of these people who were being written up in Canadian art were being described, and their work was being featured. So there was that going on in the 70s. I had one friend who was a neighbor, Goldie Rands, and she was writing criticism about the shows at Forest City, and she was one of the original members of the 2020 gallery that preceded the Forest City Gallery. And she always talked to me about people and had gatherings of people she knew at her house, and was kind of in the center of things. So she introduced me to people. And then my husband had his first sabbatical, so this was the end of the 70s. We went to Boulder, Colorado, and that was a great art community, partly because the things that I liked and was intuitively drawn to, pattern and decoration, female subjects, that was hot in Boulder. And it was such a shock to me to find there were like-minded people, many, many people. There was a group of women artists called Front Range Women in the Arts. It was one of the first women's collectives, and it just had its 40th anniversary. And I said I was an artist, and so they said, fine, and come on in. And I was able to pay, some sort of the dues that they all paid in order to publish things about their work or to have group shows. They didn't ask to see my work. I just told them I was an artist, and they said that I was, I don't know what they called me, an adjunct member of the group. And they had meetings once a month, and I would go to those. And I felt really nourished by them. At that time, I was interested in Celtic iconography, and I decided to teach myself how to be a Celtic monk living on one of those Ionian islands and learning to do very complicated patterns as not as they did, as a homage to God, but as a sort of creative challenge, because that was the kind of thing I liked. And so I began work that became the Celtic series. And first, I imitated all of the, not all, because some of them were way beyond me, but I learned to do interlace, and I learned to do certain kinds of decoration on a very minuscule scale, and now I can hardly even see them, let alone do them. But it was a good exercise, and I felt that I was doing things that now were my work, and that I had found something that really engaged me. So I did several of those paintings, and my first exhibition, solo exhibition, at the Museum London was called the Celtic series. And it was the work that I did from the beginning, which looked like Celtic manuscripts, to the end that looked like much more contemporary pattern, but still very fine. And Brenda Wallace at Museum London gave me that exhibition. 5 months before the exhibition, the museum closed. And that was a very weird time in London's life, in history, because of a conflict, a huge conflict between Brenda and the board. And I just didn't know what would happen, but a few months after they closed entirely, the basement opened up for exhibition. So that was where my work was shown, along with another larger comprehensive exhibition of female work, maybe historical, I can't really remember, and then something else in one of the other basement rooms. But to me, it was coming into, being a professional, really. Getting a catalog that Goldie wrote for me, seeing my work in a museum setting, feeling that I was making a little bit of headway. I still didn't feel all that comfortable in the London community, but I did feel that I could call myself an artist at that point. I went on with pattern. I'm trying to remember what the evolution was. I know the patterns got simpler and simpler and bigger, and finally I was painting them on a large scale, and they were abstract, but I was relating them to other kinds of decoration, maybe even architectural decoration. And I had an exhibition in 1986 at the McIntosh Gallery. And that was, again, a kind of achievement for me. The artists in London, from my point of view, and other people will have very different views of the whole society, were kind of in little capsules or tribes. So there was the people who were at Western. There were the people who were at Fanshawe. There were the people who came out of Beale and thought universities were unnecessary. There were the odds and ends, there was 44 City Collective. There were other kinds of little energies elsewhere, but it didn't feel to me like a whole community coming together. It was a bunch of people who had the same goals perhaps, but had separate ways of getting there and separate works that they had any respect for. So doing decorative work in the 80s here was a lonely thing. But fortunately, some curators were generous. I think that the other thing that comes, the thread that comes into this that I hadn't mentioned before is my Judaism. Mm-hmm. In London, there are very few Jews. I think 0.75% of London is Jewish. That's under 3,000 people. And it's a little community, pretty parochial. And I didn't find it comfortable either because my Judaism didn't correspond to theirs. It was kind of observant and synagogue-oriented, and I didn't feel that way. I felt more like a Jewish person who appreciated and respected the culture and tradition, but not the way it was practiced here. One of the things that shifted me in the direction of incorporating my Jewish self into my work was discovering that there were cookbooks written in the Holocaust. These cookbooks were memories that people who were incarcerated would write down so that they could recall a time when they felt human. And they were trying to remember the communities that were being destroyed and the kind of life that they had. So I did a piece about that. And then I discovered another book that was based on the papers that were collected by the scribes of the Spanish Inquisition. And this was a kind of revelation to me that how people cooked, how they behaved, was evidence against them in court. And the way that this happened was that in 1492, after Isabella and Ferdinand expelled the Jews, some Jews converted to Christianity as a way of staying in Spain. Others fled to Italy and Sicily and to the Ottoman Empire. The ones that stayed had to behave as Christians and had to convert actually to Christianity, but they maintained a secret life in which they practiced their Jewish customs. Some of those customs involved food preparation. And so if your neighbor saw you at a funeral giving people eggs rather than meat, it meant that you were behaving in a Jewish way, not in a Christian way. And so he would denounce you to the authorities and you would be put on trial. And there was a cookbook written about the trials of these Jews who were informed on by their servants, by their neighbors, because they practiced the culinary side of their life in secret, but it was evident to the people who were turning them in. And I did a series of works based on that whole situation called Testimony. Then I began to think about the good side of the politics that preceded that expulsion. And that was when the Muslims and Jews were coexisting in a kind of almost ideal society during the medieval period in Spain. And the work that I did about that was called Andalusia. And in that work, I was trying to bring together, show that their coexistence resulted in a great flowering of possibilities for both Muslims and Jews. And so I did work based on cuisine and on writing and on using a lunar calendar, things that Jews and Muslims had in common. And that was when that particular thought entered the work. So at that point, which is around 2000, I did 3 large installations called Andalusia. And it was recalling the tolerance, the culture of tolerance of that period. Then I began to think about relationships between Jews and Muslims now, which are fraught, of course. And I began to try to describe in my work the contemporary situation, but also in terms of the similarities between the cultures, rather than the things that drove them apart, which of course was primarily that they were, they had claims to the same piece of land. So somebody was thrown out and somebody was sitting there. And both of them felt they had legitimate rights to that land, and there was arguments on both sides. So I wanted to show that they were the same but different. And I did work with a lot of doubling and bringing together of images, having to do with borders, having to do with similar customs. It's hard to describe, but if you see them, you will see what my strategy was. And so I worked like that for some years. The thing I think that differentiates the work that I did about Jews and Muslims from most work that's done by both Jewish and Muslim artists is that many artists see the Jewish-Muslim issues as part of, and only part of, the occupation of Palestine, the West Bank and Gaza by Israel. And I think that fits very neatly into a kind of attitude toward colonialism that's very prevalent, especially in campuses today. And then there was another war in '67. Israel increased its territories and went into a very dark period, I feel, of occupation. So I started thinking about the plight of the refugees, and particularly the Palestinians, and also thought about the situation in Afghanistan. During the Russian war in Afghanistan that went on for 20 years, rugs were made incorporating images of war. So there would be trucks, and there would be rockets, and there would be rifles, so forth. So I kind of incorporated that idea with the idea of Palestinian embroidery, cross-stitch embroidery. And I began making very large paintings, 8 by 6 feet, very laboriously, kind of channeling the sort of frustrations and determinations of people who were being occupied, but who were looking for a way to describe their situation or to overcome the frustrations of it. The search for order, I think, is one of the things that these embroideries describe. And of course, their life is complete upheaval. So I began these paintings, and I began doing very small marks on very large surfaces. And this has been going on for 5 years. And the work behind me is the grand finale. And I don't know what will happen after that. Probably I'll work small, just as an antidote, but I don't know what the subject will be. I don't know where I'll go from here. Usually I go through a sort of tormented period, and then I end up about 1 inch from where I was before. So maybe that's what's going to happen. As far as legacy, I don't know how to answer that, except that I've always tried to be honest with myself in the work that I do. I'm not particularly influenced by all sorts of things that I see swirling around me, all this stuff, comic book stuff, Japanese this, or extremely intellectual work that when you see it, you don't know what the content is really. I want my work to continue to be understood at least on the superficial visual basis, and then maybe people would ask questions about the content. But the content isn't about the fashions of art, it's about living in the world. And maybe that's my legacy, as an example of somebody who feels that artists respond to the life that they're living, and the more completely they can do that, the more successful the word, the more integrity they can feel that they have. So onward and upward.